So Jeff, first of all, thank you for coming on. It's I finished your book yesterday, and the whole time while I was reading it, I couldn't help but think, like, I wonder how this book would have been different if it had, if you had written it this spring rather than published it in January and probably written it in the latter part of last year.
Yeah, I
Uh,
wrote it. It took 18 months to write and publish it, so you can imagine what it looks like. Yeah.
Right. And so there's so much going on right now, and there's so much to discuss, and we're going to get into as much of it as we can. But for people that aren't maybe familiar with you or the book, can you just bring us up to speed on who you are, and then a brief intro to the book, and we'll just take whatever vein opens up?
Sure. Probably the best way to who I am. I'm a technology entrepreneur, have been for the last 20 years, on a whole bunch of different boards, technology boards, advisory boards, helping out in technology companies. I co-founded a company called BuildDirect, and created about $500 million of market cap in that company, in its peak, and so been at the front seat of technology for a long time, and so all friends are in the technology field. I wrote the book specifically because I, what I felt is people aren't putting together two and two. So technology is deflationary. Technology makes things cost less. In fact, every single giant company, the monopolies in technology, Google, Amazon, Facebook, everything else, you use them because they're free, right? So prices keep coming down lower and lower, and that was not being connected to the economic system that we currently live in. So I wrote the book because it gives predictable discourse to society. If you run a system, if everything's moving to technology, and we're inflating in an old way of running an economy. So the book's called The Price of Tomorrow: Why Deflation is Key to an Abundant Future.
Hmm. So, a lot of the themes that you mentioned in the book and that you briefly touched on just then, a lot have to do with, as you just said, the rapid pace of technological advancement, exponential in many cases, and the deflationary effect that is having. So prices are falling in certain categories that are basically exposed to that or subject to that exponential effect. Simultaneously, and this is extremely relevant right now, we have inflation. We've had a persistent policy of inflation for, let's say, the last 100 years, roughly, but certainly since 1971, and accelerating all the time. Just let's start with this. What's your response? We heard yesterday that the bailout package in the United States is going to be $6 trillion plus. What is your response to that? Just your reflexive response to that.
You read the book. It's all predicted in the book, right? So
It is.
this is all predicted way before this all happens, because it's math. It's so people still isolate technology thinking it's just in your Google searches, and you can get free there, but everywhere else should inflate. But look at your phone, right? The apps on your phone, they're all free too.
Mm-hmm.
And that technology that's the underpinning of our society is moving into every industry. So if that's true and it's exponential, in fact, the only way to combat that deflationary force is printing money at a rate that is exponential as well. So you have exponential technology deflation, that could be a good thing, and you have exponential printing of money to stop deflation, and it seems insane. So that's my response. It's going to break. It's just a matter of when it breaks.
Yeah, and this is a kind of a boogeyman that gets brought up a lot, and the boogeyman is deflation. Of course, that's the subject of your book, but many mainstream economists will decry deflation, and they'll insist that there has to be a certain amount of inflation for investment, for economic growth, for job creation, et cetera. What do you think is the fault with that reasoning? Why do you think deflation is such a boogeyman, and why do you think it could actually, in a free market, would actually be a positive thing rather than a negative thing?
So let's just go to first principles of inflation or deflation first,
Mm-hmm.
right? So neither is good or bad. It's just who wins and who loses, right? So in inflation, if you have assets, you win. as they are inflated away. They don't lose value. If you have cash, you lose. Deflation is the opposite. So the bunch of the economic arguments that come down to why deflation is bad come out of the 30s, and what they say is people will wait for prices to get cheaper, and that'll cause a downward spiral in the economy as people wait and wait and wait. But I don't think that actually is valid today. People line up for the newest iPhone around the block, right? The technology deflation allows us all to get more with less. In fact, I think we're asking the wrong question. The scarcity today and in the future will be high-paying jobs to keep as technology is eroding more and more jobs, and we're inflating to try to make everything more expensive. You want insanity? That's insanity, right? Because it leads to social discourse. If deflation is allowed to happen, the real question: do we actually need that many jobs? If things all over the world kept coming down lower and lower in price, there's a concept, and I think a lot of people miss this. Economics is not about value; it's about perceived value, but it's actually about scarcity. And so the air we breathe should be the most valuable thing on planet, more than water, more than anything else. Why is it free? It's only not free underwater, or if we polluted the air so bad, it would make it scarce. You can't go, and technology underpinning the world today is creating abundance everywhere, and we're not letting that happen because we're manipulating.
Right. And another, I think, danger of this approach to things, and I was shared a chart last night, actually. I think we would all know this already, but the chart really brings it home. And it's showing the level of inflation in a variety of different industries and categories. And so, of course, you've got the highest inflation in public or government funded, subsidized, or directly controlled industries. And then you've got the highest deflation in private industries, like you mentioned, cell phones or TVs or technology, basically. And so you just articulated one of the dangers of that. I think another one is that as this turmoil grows and this disequilibrium is fostered more and more, and the inequality is expanded for many of the reasons that you just touched on, there's more calls for the disenfranchised to expand the powers and the breadth and scope of the state in order to provide some form of of welfare. And as the danger of that, aside from the obvious ones, is that as the state becomes more integrated into the economy and responsible for more production and the allocation of resources and the providing of services, then the inflationary effect is felt even more, because those services are the ones that feel it more. So the larger the government involvement, the larger that inflationary process is felt by the people who feel it the most.
I'll expand on that a little bit.
Please, yeah.
So today, imagine I have a house, and I have lots of real estate. I'm a technology, and so I'm a beneficiary of what we're talking about, right? So I'm in the winning camp. So my real estate goes up in price a lot as we inflate, as we protect it from falling, right? And people that are renting that real estate, prices go up and they lose. So one side is picking the pocket without knowing that they're picking the pocket of the other side. And the other side is yelling for government subsidies to be able to keep up with a manipulated inflation rate, because we're manipulating economies. And both sides of the aisle are screaming at each other on different solutions, all on the same foundation. And that foundation is, like you said, we've been running that foundation for the last 100 years, and it's worked. It just won't work anymore, right? So you could look at the math, and if it took $185 trillion to provide essentially 2% nominal growth over the last 20 years, $185 trillion has created $46 trillion of growth, real GDP growth. You just ask, can that continue? But it's worse, right? And so, or ask, if you didn't provide $185 trillion of made up money pulling demand forward, what would the real economy look like, right? You would see the natural trend that's been there all along. But it's worse than that, because technology is exponential. And that means that if it took $185 trillion looking backwards, it's going to take that much more looking forwards. And all of that is just a gift to asset owners, mm-hmm. at the expense of everybody else. So no wonder they're rising. You have politicians on both sides of the aisles, both wrong, mm-hmm. because they don't see the fundamental change is way over here.
Yeah. And of course, you can't really expect people that are the most disenfranchised by, or maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but it's not surprising that the people that are the most disenfranchised are most susceptible to, taking the debate on expanding government handouts and government power, because, they're in very desperate situations. And
what would you do?
Exactly.
If you couldn't feed your family, what would you do?
Right. And in the short term, maybe it helps, but in the long term, it just exacerbates the existing problem, right?
Exactly.
And that's another point that I'd like to hang out on for a second, where you mentioned the amount of debt required to foster economic growth continues to increase, right? And so I think a figure you gave in the book, something on the order of, the global economy is in the 80 trillion, and the amount of debt needed to get it there is 140, something like that.
No, 250 trillion. 250 on an $80 trillion global economy. Mm-hmm. And 185 trillion of that has come in the last 20 years, more and more every year. Mm-hmm. That's the known. There's a whole bunch of off-balance sheet, unfunded pensions. It's way worse than that. Right. Now think about where we are now. What will the global economy be looking forward? 40 trillion? And what will the debt be? You see what's happening. It's actually it's all predicted right in the book, exactly what happens, because fundamentally the world is operating differently. Yeah. Because more and more of the world is moving to technology. Mm-hmm. In fact, what's happening right now, work at home, look at Zoom prices, look at everything else. My whole portfolio is doing really well because it's all technology, and it's moving coming out of this, it's going to move faster to technology.
Mm-hmm. And how do we come out of this? Because a lot is made of, and we of course will get to Bitcoin at some point in this conversation, but a lot, Bitcoin for some is positioned as, a call option on a future financial system, right? It's a hedge against the failure of the existing system. To others, it's different things, but many of us look at this insanity and think, how long can this go on? When will the confidence be lost in the currency, in the government, in this whole system? What's your take on where we are now? And do you have any inkling of an insight as to how much longer this can persist? And how are you, hedging your bets accordingly?
So are you saying specifically with Bitcoin, or?
No, I just mean with everything that's happening now, $6 trillion bailout. Obviously, the coronavirus is a big black swan. How much longer do you think the legacy system can persist? And what are you doing to hedge your bets and come out of it, whatever come out of it means, as unscathed and as possible?
I'm looking at the opportunities and the technology companies that'll benefit on the other side of this. I'm absolutely bullish, massively bullish on Bitcoin as the hedge that you said. Mm-hmm. I suspect that this is what happens, and it's not that it's Bitcoin specifically. It's what is money, right? It's just the exchange of value, mm-hmm. right? And for that to work, there has to be trust in the system. So if you pretend, if it's just a bunch of it's faces and zeros, ones and zeros on it, and if you change the underlying structure by changing the number of zeros on it, you lose trust in the system. Mm-hmm. So what I suspect in a normal environment, and where if we hadn't gotten this far apart, global governments could come together and provide a Bretton Woods type of framework that was tied to an exchange rate. And they might actually be able to create a global currency that was digital in nature, that looked like Bitcoin, in a normal environment that operated like Bretton Woods did, tied to the gold to gold. So that was the formulation of Bretton Woods.
Mm-hmm.
In this environment, I suspect that can't happen. I suspect that so as the U.S. is a background of currencies around the world, as they print massively, and every other government prints massively to try to get essentially game theory to get their currency down so they can protect their jobs, you're going to see a blow up of the existing system. And what I would suspect out of that is some government, maybe it's smaller, maybe it is pegs to Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And it cascades from there. Or people in the background start accumulating Bitcoin, knowing that the peg is coming, because there has to be a peg to run global trade.
Mm-hmm. In November 2018, I was in Singapore, and I went over to Jim Rogers' house. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's kind of a legendary Wall Street investor, and we had a brief discussion, only about a half an hour. But this was the scenario that he's been calling for the last decade. And he's got his own approach to it and everything like that. But this podcast, or the podcast with Jim, is actually going to precede this one. But it's he paints a very dark picture of how this plays out. And in the final page of your book, you articulated that your motivation for writing this book, aside from it being in line with your life experiences and your business and your entrepreneurship and your interests, it's kind of you're trying to bring awareness to these issues and bring awareness to where these issues could lead us if we don't handle it properly. And I share those fears, and as does Jim. What, if anything, I agree. We may see that Bitcoin may come out of this as some kind of a global monetary standard. Aside from the investment case, you mentioned technology companies and things that will benefit from the accelerating deflation. What is an individual to do in this kind of a landscape where we're probably going to see, more extreme political rhetoric, finger pointing, and the very real possibility of conflict? What is a person to do?
So if you say, what am I doing family wise? That's, I would say my portfolio is ready for this, and I have kind of escape mechanisms to other places that because you could see massive conflict out of this polarization that's happening, and that's what scares me. That's why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
In fact, you bringing me on this podcast is actually a really great. So I wrote the book because I hope really great minds will get together and figure out how to transition to a new world economy that is absolutely crucial, so that we can provide abundance to everybody. Capitalism would work perfectly if you allowed deflation to happen. Mm-hmm. Capitalism would work perfectly. Jobs would fall, and along that fall, prices would get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and you wouldn't have this massive tax on the wealthy to provide for the poor, because things would get cheaper and cheaper as you let the natural forces take care. Is capitalism the best system? It's the best system we know of, right? and so does there need to be a safety net along the way? Probably. Does there need to be? How do we transition? Not sure, but I do know this: if we just let nature take its course, we would all be a lot better.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. The thing I fear is that the social discourse, at least leading up to the current crisis, right now, many things have changed very quickly, and we're in obviously uncharted territory. But the social discourse was seemingly moving away from capitalism, using capitalism as a scapegoat for a lot of the ills that are being experienced in society. And I'm wondering if it's going to take a shock to the system on the scale of something far worse than we're seeing right now, and as we were just discussing, in order for people to be able to see the merits of that system from a different perspective. Because you've said this before, and I've said it many times as well. we don't have capitalism right now. We have a form of
crony capitalism.
crony capitalism, you know, with huge government apparatus involved in almost all economies in the world. And you can't honestly claim to have a capitalist society if the government is on the other half of every transaction via their control of the money supply, right?
So what would your house be worth without $185 trillion of printing? Right.
Right.
What would, like, it's really simple to see. And you know this right now. The banks are actually insolvent because
Right.
if they were allowed to write down their loan, if they had to write down their loans like a normal business would, the bank would be gone, right?
Yeah.
And so that it would look like subprime on steroids, and it would affect the whole system, and the system would break, and then you would rebuild anew. That's what capitalism calls for.
Right.
The problem, and people don't know it. Not enough people are talking about it. They're looking for solutions. They're desperate for solutions that are exactly the opposite of capitalism because they think capitalism is still sound.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's part of what I'm saying. That's kind of the other side. And those people that are supporting capitalism as it is today are also, in my opinion, wrong. You know, for the reasons that we just articulated. So that's what I'm thinking. Will it take a dramatic shock to wake people up to a different form of, you know, a different system, or engaging in a different system? And, you know, also kind of as a, you know, related to that, will this crisis, this COVID, you know, coronavirus crisis, give the existing system an out so that when it comes time for people to reassess, you know, why things are not working, will the scapegoat be this virus when we all know these things have been building for a very long time?
So again, we don't all know. You know, I know. There's
a lot of people listening to this.
A lot of people don't know.
Yeah.
It's not on the. It's not on the major news channels. You have talking heads on existing system that are and this sounds radical. It's not radical. It's math.
Yeah.
The existing system, as you said, is already broken. So this was just a pinprick in. So you saw it in the book. Housing was not the problem in 2008. Debt was the problem in 2008. COVID isn't the problem. Debt's the problem. We've made the system so fragile that it requires more and more, exponentially more debt. And the system's really fragile. So this is just a pin in the balloon that's made that thing unwind.
Mm-hmm.
So ironically, they say never waste a good crisis. This crisis is actually an opportunity to fix the system. I'm not sure if we'll take it. I'm not sure if we can get this message into more politicians and more leaders, or if new leaders need to be elected so that the message gets home. I'm not sure if we'll take it. You can see that the bailing out of the system, we're not taking it. Right now, but potentially this crisis is an opportunity to bring this up on the radar and have more people talking about this from a first principle standpoint.
Absolutely. And one of the phenomenons that I've noticed, you know, throughout my journey with Bitcoin and also talking with many people, is that, you know, whether you initially get access because you wanted to buy drugs on the internet, or because you wanted to make a quick buck, or the myriad reasons why people first get their first look at Bitcoin. Once, you know, if they have a curious enough mind to just take a couple of steps down that proverbial rabbit hole, then they start to see the connections to so many other things, and their education is you know, the speed of their education is ramped up dramatically. And this is, you know, almost unanimous in everyone I speak to, is that they start learning about economics, about
money work.
What is money? How does it work? What is the nature of money? The history of money, you know, all of this kind of stuff. What do you in your private life, do you talk to, you know, in social environments, or more personally, more private, do you talk about Bitcoin? What are the nature of the conversations you're having around Bitcoin? Some of the questions you're getting, is there increased interest as a result of things that have been going on over the past, 1 month or 6 months?
Yeah,
What's
so
all that?
the answer is absolutely. I would say to every friend of mine, buy no matter what. Buy some Bitcoin as a hedge.
Mhm.
Not only that, if you just think about it kind of from a, I like gold too, but gold is what is the market cap today of gold? 7.5 trillion.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was the old thing that currency was tied to, right?
Right.
So pre 71. Other than that, does gold really have any value? Should it be worth $7.5 trillion? Right. So it's because it used to be tied to the money supply and it was scarce, right?
Yeah.
It's not because of the jewelry that it's worth $7.5 trillion.
For sure. For sure. Right.
It's because it was scarce, tied to money supply.
Yeah.
And I suspect, and so when I look at Bitcoin total market cap of 150 billion, 140, whatever,
110 now, probably. Yeah.
110 billion,
Yeah.
and I think about the asymmetric return possible on Bitcoin,
Yeah.
it's a no-brainer, right? Um, Likely governments need to peg to something new, and now the question is, what are they going to peg to, right?
Yeah.
Is it going to be gold, or is it going to be something that works on a network effect? And if governments don't, like you read this in the book too, in Venezuela, you can move it across borders, you can pay for food, and so the more people that start to do this, it provides more and more trust in that, and it'll just and it works on a network effect. So I'm highly bullish
Yeah.
on that. It could go to 1,000. If it did, I would buy more.
Hmm.
It could go to, but it could go to 10 million.
Yeah. I totally agree with you there. And, to that point about gold, I mean, look what's happening just in the last couple of days with the physical markets. I'm hearing that the Perth Mint, which is one of the major suppliers of bullion and coins, they're shelled out. And then you've got things going on at the CME, and it looks like there's been, and the GATA, the Gold Antitrust Action Committee, I believe that's the name, but they've been talking about manipulation of the gold markets for years. And so they've always suspected that there was more paper gold than physical gold, and I don't think that would surprise anybody in today's landscape. But because of the increased, I guess, demand right now for gold as a flight to safety, we're seeing these cracks appear. And I think this is just one of the things that makes people more inclined, or it makes a stronger case for Bitcoin, because it's something that you can hold on your own at almost no cost or relatively low cost. You can make it so it's very difficult to confiscate. And one of the I saw Putin, because Russia and China have obviously been big buyers of gold over the last number of years, probably because they're seeing a lot of the things that we're discussing, and they're trying to hedge their own bets. But you see Putin with the big bar of gold in his hand, and he's staring at it and he's smiling, and it looks so natural to anyone that would see it. It's like, oh, well, gold, yeah, of course. That one of the most powerful people in the world would be holding that symbol of wealth and value. But it's really just a shiny rock with certain properties, and those properties meant that it was useful for a time for money. But as you mentioned, Bretton Woods was established, and then in 71 we came off of that. The reason we have fiat is because of gold's deficiencies. At least that's one of the reasons, right? And so we need to, and I know there's a lot of gold bugs out there, and there's still very ardent supporters of gold, but I think Bitcoin just represents an upgrade in so many different ways, with, of course, some downside as well. And it's very new, and it's very foreign, and it's a paradigm shift in many ways. So it's going to take some time for people to
The
cross that.
on-ramps are hard. People are worried about losing their keys and everything.
Absolutely.
And we're getting it stolen. So those are some real, but there's ways around those, and that'll get easier over time.
Exactly. And so I think, in the future, it'll become more and more silly to see, us old world people, now whether the future is 100 years or 1,000 years or whatever, holding up these shiny rocks and saying, oh, isn't this stuff great? The whole country is devoted to acquiring this, when the landscape will have shifted to using something else with better attributes to perform the function of money. And as a result, all the value will accrue to that, and less value will
Completely agree.
Yeah.
Because it's really just an exchange of trust.
Right.
It's trust. And so what you're talking about in the futures market of gold and the paper market of gold is trust. why there was counterparty risk in 2008 and banks stopped lending to each other is nobody could trust their balance sheet because they knew that they were propping up assets that weren't there,
Mhm.
right? That's happening again right now all over the world. You have this counterparty risk because nobody trusts the other side, and it's all because you have this fiat currency that we're propping up these. It's an unmitigated disaster right right now.
Yeah, I know. And isn't it surreal to be watching it play out like in real time? I mean, I think well, you articulated in the book. So of course you saw this coming. Many of us in the Bitcoin community, gold community, whatever, have seen this coming. The writing's been on the wall for a long time. And many of us were surprised that 2008 wasn't the,
Yeah, yeah,
the final act. And here we are now, and it's all been pushed forward so dramatically because of this economic shutdown due to this virus. I mean, we were worried about this unfolding regardless of any, full red light economic shutdown. But now we have just demand stopping in
yeah.
almost all sectors and industries across the world. I mean, isn't it surreal? Like, what are you thinking about all this?
It's surreal. So I think first off, I think in investing, right? So I'm going to put two different hats. I wrote the book because I care about the world that my kids grow up in,
Hmm.
right? So the book is how do we transition to a better and be part of that conversation, and so I care a lot about that. My own personal investing, so beside now, if I think COVID and everything else, first safety, right? First, family safe, friends safe, everything else. So do the things, safety. Next, is your oxygen mask on, right? So there's people make really bad decisions out of fear, um, and and if you could just take a deep breath and say, where are the opportunities in this market? It's staggering. So this is a reset. This is a global reset, and you could play what the question I think most of, will the U.S. and governments around the world be able to kick the can down the road one more time? Right? Maybe,
Right.
and maybe. And so, if that's the case, you probably don't want to be in cash for very long, right? You want to be in now, but if they destroy the value of cash, right, then you need to be in assets and everything else. But all of our bets, all of those, so that's one. So you need to be, where are the opportunities, and most of those best opportunities are in technology companies that exhibit network effects that drive. So lots of opportunities there. You can buy low. On the other side, if they're incapable of doing that, then press the reset button, right? So there's a whole bunch of different investments that do well in either case, and so personally, this is a really great time for my investments. The companies I'm involved with, all the companies I'm involved with, are excelling. I actually hate saying that publicly with
Right.
so many people hurting, um, because it doesn't last if only a few people win and nobody else wins, right? So we have to set up a more fair society. But if I would say to listeners, this is a time to take a deep breath and see where the opportunities are. Some of them we've mentioned here already, but there are going to be lots of opportunities out of this, no matter what happens.
Mm-hmm. And as far as opportunities for, let's say, equity investing, or investing in traditional markets, how much of a consideration do you think the counterparty risk that is right now in the environment of potentially systemic failure? So what's a stock in Tesla worth if the system crumbles and it's not honored or something like that? Is that something that you consider at all?
I do, and that's why the governments are printing so much money, right? So to pretend the money is there, so there's not the counterparty risk. So
Mm-hmm.
that is exactly what keep the system going.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those stocks in that world are really scary, right? That because if this turns into a deflationary depression, like the 30s, which it easily could, then are people going to be buying $120,000, $150,000 car, right? They'll be hoarding their capital, and they'll be buying assets, and more people will be out of work, which will cause it to slow more, and so yeah, there is some risk on the stock market and some of the companies because of that.
Do you think it's more likely we see a deflationary depression or inflationary depression?
So I think first deflationary, and then governments try to destroy the currency to stop that from happening, and then it turns parabolic.
And in terms of timelines, for the deflationary part, how long do you think that period would last?
Oh, this is hard. And for everybody listening, everything we're talking about are probabilities,
right?
in a world that's just changed and is changing day to day. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what I go back to is, what's the first principle? What are people likely to do in response to that? What have they done? What are they likely to do? You read the book, but so here's a really good example. Blockbuster, Netflix, right? Blockbuster could have bought Netflix for $50 million, and everybody with perfect hindsight says they're crazy. Why didn't they do that? They had 9,000 stores, and that download speeds at that time to download movies were, Netflix was a bad business. Mm-hmm. All they missed was how fast technology was moving, and it rendered their 9,000 stores irrelevant overnight. The same thing that drove all their success for years drove their failure immediately. Mm-hmm. Our whole economic system looks like that today. And so what did Blockbuster do? They added candy aisles to their stores, right? And it seems kind of crazy in retrospect when they're dealing with something else. They add candy aisles to the stores because that's the innovation that they see. If you think about what's happening in the financial markets today, we're adding candy aisles to the stores. Mm-hmm. Because we're not doing the things that it's changed. The world has changed, and so if you understand what people are likely going to do if they're caught in an old system, then you can assign probabilities to different sets of outcomes. And so I think the probabilities, governments around the world are going to print and all over the world. And if US prints, and then China's going to print more, right? Europe's going to print more. Everybody's going to print. Maybe in all of those, the US doesn't lose its value because everybody's printing so fast. and so you have everybody racing and asset prices go back up. But it is that in that environment, it is highly bad. Something's going to break. Nobody mm-hmm. can trust the world. You can't trust global trade, right? Mm-hmm. So the trade tariffs right now around China are really around manipulation of currencies.
Yeah. And, once that kind of dislocation of international trade gets kicked off, whether it's just because price signals can't really be trusted, or whether it's because currencies are messed up, or trade restrictions and trade wars, that precipitates
all of the above.
Right.
So essentially, it's mispricing of the real value of things because right. You've gamed the system. Mm-hmm. And what Bitcoin does is allows real trust to come back.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've often thought I think it's somewhat foolish to believe that you can have global, trade, not even free trade, but global trade with hundreds of different currencies. I mean, because you're using a different unit of measure for all these different things. And then one country can surreptitiously, print more or restrict their money supply or do whatever they want. And that disrupts the flow of trade tremendously. So I think in hindsight, we'll look back at this period and say, well, duh, of course this couldn't have worked with, all these different monetary standards or currencies operating around the world.
That was the lead up to World War II. Bretton Woods came out of that.
Right.
Because game theory says that when people work together, everybody wins.
Right.
And so Bretton Woods tied to the gold exchange came out of that, so you could enable global trade to flourish. And then and when 71, when US couldn't pay for its Vietnam, going off the gold exchange makes sense, and it became the de facto currency of the world.
Right.
That's breaking down right now because every single other country knows that there's too much risk with that.
Yeah. And, relatively the Bretton Woods period was worked pretty well,
It worked really well.
right, in a lot of ways. And but that thing, if you give someone the power to create money out of thin air, or you give someone the control of the issuance of currency, at some point it will be corrupted. So all it was a trust that the US wasn't going to print more gold than they had. But
well, totally. And for a long time they didn't. A long time it didn't look so bad, and it should remain trusted. It's just you read this, but domestic issues always take priority over international ones. When your family always takes priority over your neighbor, right? It's the way we're wired.
Yeah.
So if one person has the control of of something, it'll work for a long time until that person is in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And then they'll change the rules.
Right.
That's what we're seeing on a global basis.
Yeah. And again, one of the reasons why I think Bitcoin is gaining so much traction, because it's a money that can't be manipulated. Of course, governments can buy a bunch of it, but once you blow that wad, then it's blown, and you can't just drum up more out of thin air. But Jeff, right before we go to the last part, I wanted to circle back, and I'm not trying to look for a specific time or probability, but I'm just trying to get an idea. Do you think if we go kind of deflationary and then radically inflationary, that deflationary period is relatively short-lived?
That depending. Just remember, every single bet we're making right now is specifically a bet against what governments are going to do.
Right.
So we can watch for that. So $6 trillion. Number one, I don't think it's enough I don't think it's close to enough to stop this. I think we're already in that cycle.
Yeah.
So I think there's going to be more right behind it. And so I think we're going to move into a deflationary cycle.
A deflationary cycle.
Deflationary cycle at first.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fiscal policy, you could helicopter money, you could stop that from happening. So again, these probabilities, it's hard to say exactly what I think is going to happen, because tomorrow governments could say 10 trillion, right, and turn it exactly the opposite way, right? Or 50 trillion. What number is made up money enough of a number to break this? That I just don't know.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Jeff, the last part here is, so it's a list of questions. And so we've got about 10 minutes. There are there's a number of them. So you answer them, you can say pass, but you can answer them as quickly as you like. Okay. And, and then the last part is just some quick word association. So the first one is, what is money? How would you define money?
Exchange value.
If you had to explain Bitcoin to a 10-year-old, what would you say?
Digital scarcity. I would say that's a harder one. I would say money is only the underlying trust that any paper money is only the underlying trust that the government says is that value.
How
Bitcoin is the same.
How will you know if Bitcoin has failed?
It doesn't achieve a network effect. Which is already achieving a network effect. More and more people into it. But it dies out. Something else replaces it.
What does Bitcoin?
By the way, so I'm gonna add to that.
Yeah.
Governments right now could come together, if they could come together and create their own, if it was all tied together with the digital scarcity, right? That some of the same rules of Bitcoin, and they might be able to stop Bitcoin from happening. But I suspect that can't happen in this environment.
What does Bitcoin succeeding look like to you?
It's, I think it could be $1 million, $10 million a coin.
What was the most useful resource when you were learning about Bitcoin that helped foster your understanding the most?
Oh, you do a good job. Raoul Paul, and quite honestly, there's a whole bunch of people way smarter than me in Bitcoin specifically. I'm way more looking at the macro and why something like this makes a lot of sense.
Right. What's one piece of advice you would give to someone around Bitcoin if they're just starting to dip their toes in the water, or they're the person that came up to you and said, what is this all about? What would you say?
My wife has put together an information package because so many friends have asked for it to kind of how to be safe. Because probably not your listeners, but the number one thing is, isn't that going to get hacked? Aren't I going to lose all my money and everything else? And so how to do how to do it safely and how to get it into cold storage.
Is that resource only for friends and
no,
private acquaintances?
I'd be happy to share.
I'd love to see it. I'd love to see it.
You could probably give us some hints on how to make it better.
What movie or song is most related to Bitcoin in your opinion?
Oh, pass.
Can Bitcoin be stopped? If so, what is its biggest vulnerability? If not, why not?
I think what I said, government, it could be stopped if governments actually did what was required, and put together something that couldn't be manipulated. Yeah. Failing that, I don't think it can be stopped.
We touched on the possibility of this happening a few minutes ago, but when, if ever, do you think the first central bank will start adding Bitcoin to the reserves, either publicly or privately?
So I would be surprised if it isn't starting to happen right now. Whether it's smaller governments, whether it's what would I do? I would start biting slowly, so that I didn't push the price up. If I was and then go all in. If I were a central government and if I were a government.
Yeah. What have you learned about yourself, or how have you changed, if at all, as a result of learning about and interacting with Bitcoin? There's a common, a lot of people describe certain behavioral changes. Has there been any in you?
So not so much on Bitcoin. I think, from the book, the first principles about technology and what that means led me to Bitcoin, not the other way around. Mm-hmm. So I kind of understood the macro, and then that led me to Bitcoin rather than trying to figure out Bitcoin and then looking at the macro.
Right. So kind of maybe a reverse trajectory for a lot of maybe the younger generation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Do you have any controversial or contrarian views? If none on Bitcoin, if on Bitcoin first, but if none on Bitcoin, on anything.
Okay. Not on Bitcoin. I think they're right in line with what you're saying. I think when I say technology is deflationary and that's a good thing, people can't understand that because they've lived in an inflationary environment all their life. Mm-hmm. So it's a very contrarian view.
Right. Ballpark estimate of Bitcoin's price in 5 years' time.
5 years' time, 500K.
Would you? This is a question from a previous guest. Would you sell all your Bitcoin to see it succeed?
No.
What is
because if it succeeds, then it means I need the Bitcoin.
Right. It's a bit of a trap question. What is one question you'd like to see added to this list?
Besides Bitcoin, what's your best investment right now, or what do you think is the best investment in this cycle?
And what's your answer to that question?
Technology companies.
Anything specifically?
I think the platforms do well through this. Amazon, Google, Facebook. I think those in the big cap. I think those, no matter what, do well. But there's a whole bunch of smaller technology companies. A lot of those are private, but it can experience the exact same type of experience that from a way lower cost base.
Right. Okay. Last part. So this is a word association. I'll just say a word. You tell me the first thing that pops into your head.
Okay.
Democracy.
All I can think of is not today. We don't have it.
The Lightning Network.
Bitcoin.
Government.
What comes to my mind is support for a population, but that's not what it's manipulated today. So both of those.
Human rights.
Equality, fairness.
Violence.
Predictable out of what's happening.
Trump.
Frightening, and I'm going to add to this. In 2008, if what should have happened happened, Trump would have been bankrupt, right? Completely bankrupt. He would not be the president today because all of his loans would have gone to the real estate prices would have collapsed everywhere, and the mirage of somebody that pretends to get money for will handouts everywhere else would have been laid bare. So it's worth considering that. And if we do this, if we manipulate capitalism, what we're going to get the next time too.
Ego.
Well, I think it's the word humility comes to mind.
FOMO.
Most of society today.
Wealth.
To me, happiness comes to mind.
Privacy.
Illusion.
Hate speech.
Again, predictable and frightening.
Gold.
Former money.
Guns.
A market opportunity. I don't want to say market opportunity, but people will buy them right now.
Revolution.
Coming.
Socialism.
Just as bad as a system on the other side.
Family.
Most important.
Inequality.
It leads to the other things you're talking about: guns, violence, everything else.
Liberty.
Ironically, actually, I think of U.S. and Canada when you say liberty, and I hope that's still true.
Energy.
Again, lower and lower, deflationary.
And finally, Bitcoin.
The future of money.
Jeff, that's our hard stop time. I really appreciate you making the time for this conversation today. Really enjoyed it, and I do hope we get the chance to continue it at some point in the near future. The book is The Price of Tomorrow: Why Deflation is the Key to an Abundant Future. Is there anywhere that you wanted to direct people that want to learn more about you or the book?
Amazon's probably best. And then from there, my website, jeffreybooth.com.
Yeah. Well, man, things are happening really fast these days, it seems. So we'll probably have a whole slew of other topics to address in a couple months' time. So maybe we'll try to reconnect then and continue.
Awesome. Thanks very much.
All right, brother. Take care.
Okay. See ya.
Bye-bye.